Hey, and welcome back. This is going to be the final video. It is the part 5 of The Lieutenant by Kate Grenville. It starts at page 291 and goes through to page 300 and the end, basically. And so part 5 is called Antigua, and 1836. And so, from the end of last section 287, we were left not really knowing whether Rook was actually going to go back, be court-martialed and be sentenced to death, or go back, be court-martialed and still be alive. But this title would allude somehow to the fact that perhaps he survives. So let's go in. And yes, almost 50 years later, the earth still turned and the stars still burned, and Daniel Rook still looked up and watched them. Beautiful rhyme, as you notice when you say it out loud, that. And so, yes, 50 years later, in 1836, Daniel Rook is still alive, and he'd learned many things. He learnt that the naked eye could see things a telescope could not, which perhaps is a metaphor, maybe literal, but a metaphor for the fact that the beauty of what human beings can see as opposed to machines. It took a soul to wonder at the beauty of those already discovered. So yes, while the instruments of astronomy could find new stars and add them to the sum of the world's knowledge, it took a soul to wonder at the beauty, at the uniqueness of mankind or humanity in its ability to wonder and connect with one another. And we find out what happened. They hadn't hanged him after all, and he'd gone on his knees and given thanks to God. And they said you could continue in the service on the condition that you apologize to Governor Gilbert and accept a loss of rank, and he refused. He knew why he had been spared. And that's an interesting thing, because he's kind of not particularly a man of faith. He had his own sense of faith, I guess, but not a man of particular religious faith. And here he thanks God and knows why he has been spared. And it was not to serve His Majesty. He went straight from the court to offer himself to another cause. So he's serving another cause. He's standing up on principle. And so what has happened to him has made him realize that he's actually meant to do something with his life. And that is everything he's learnt in New South Wales through his interactions with Tagaran has prepared him for this. And this cause took him back to this place that he never thought to revisit, Antigua. Remember, Antigua is an island in the Caribbean, off the coast of North America. It is not in Australia. Please don't write about that. I had students a few years ago tell me all about going back to Australia, and I realised that they thought Antigua was in Australia. No, Antigua is off the coast of the North America, and he has come back to Antigua. That was the first place he went with the Marines. Remember, where he saw his first slaves, the first black people he'd encountered, and he wondered at. He recognized that they were not like they couldn't be bought and sold like a horse or a watch. They're not an object. They have a humanity, and he listened to their language, and he thought, while it was foreign, he recognized it was language, and therefore they were human beings and equally valuable. And there's this beautiful symmetry that he's now come back to there at the end of his life. And in Antigua, he once watched a young lieutenant of the Marines hanged for disobeying. He too had disobeyed, but he'd been spared. And so it was only right that Antigua should take his life and make use of it. And now this life was fading, a star at dawn. It's come to the end of his life. So in this end of his life, he's lying awake in the dark, and he realizes that the final darkness, death, might be far off. So close to the ends of his life. There's some descriptions of the room and interesting, this freedom of the birds continues. It was in New South Wales, so many chapters with the birds. Now here, the parrots are chattering away in the guava tree. They are free, and so too is Daniel Rook at the end of his life. He looks at the around the room, and he sees the broken curtain, and he'd stitched it up before and reattached the rings. We get this impression of this old, worn house that he's in. He's not a man of wealth. He's sick, and he'd imagined himself fixing it again, but he couldn't because it's been weeks since he'd had the strength to do anything other than sit up in bed. And now he's looking around, and he notices lots of details in his room, and you can read them through there. And he has a servant woman. Her name's Henrietta. Some of you may wish to refer to her in your essay writing. She was looking after him, and she stays out of a sense of honour. He hasn't been able to pay her for maybe a year. So again, that idea of he's poor now. He doesn't have a lot of money. But she's willing. She says, "You have been good for us, for me and for us." And she means the slaves. He has given his life for them. And so I've written here atoning. It's like this way of actually making up for the part he played in the wrong that was perpetrated on the Indigenous people, and particularly those, or the intention of the wrong that was perpetrated on the Indigenous people back in New South Wales. Well, then he says, this is so cool, this Rook moment. He says, he's given his life for him. Well, that was a little dramatic. He was not yet 30 when he'd begun to give his life for him, and now he's 74. So it's 2/3, something like 2/3 of a life. And actually, he gets really detailed and pedantic and accurate here. And he says it's 22/37 of a life, 44 years. And he, in his head, he wonders how sick he would have to be for numbers to leave him. Anyway, 2/3 of a life. And then he made his choice. That brought him here to Antigua, to this little house on a hill above English Harbour. And we learn that Rook has actually married. He had a wife, a son, and a daughter, but they are dead or elsewhere, so they've gone now. And now it's just himself and Henrietta. And I think it's kind of cool that he married and had a son and a daughter. I think we imagine that either the wife is probably dead, and the others moved away maybe. Anyway, and so now we describe Henrietta buys him, brings him mangoes from the tree and this yam, and he sort of thinks, oh, oatmeal would be good, but in England he used to have oatmeal, and now maybe they could buy it, but only if you had money, and so he gets what he can get from his trees. He had bought Henrietta at auction when he still had money, and then he was used to it, like he did it often. He stood with the other men and counted upwards aloud, turn and turn about with them until they stopped. How many had he bought? He'd started a list at the beginning, but left off after a time. We get this impression he bought numerous slaves. He says, I bought as many as I could. Bought and freed, of course, and how they hated him for that. Those men around him in the auction yard, they agreed amongst themselves to bid the price up and to try and ruin him faster. And now there was nothing, just the water in the well, the mangoes on the trees, and the yams in the garden. Go, he says. He tries to send Henrietta away. I can't pay you. You must find another place. And she refused silently and stayed with him. And he now thinks about this act. He says he supposes he should be sorry for it now, that choice he made 46 years ago. And he tries it out, regret, remorse. He thinks about that choice he made, and here we're assuming it's the choice he made to actually disobey the order, or rather refuse to obey a similar order. And he tested the words out about what he felt, and he he thinks, and he wishes his wife were alive. He wishes he could taste oatmeal, and all of these things he felt, but he did not seem to be feeling regret. He could say the word regret, the words of regret could be summoned, but not the pang, not the feeling. Regret, glimpsed out of the corner of the eye, flickered, flamed, expired. So he doesn't have regret. So I guess even though it's led him here, the end of his life, where now he's poverty-stricken, and he doesn't feel regret for the moment he took that choice he made. I guess there's a peace in it that he has done the right thing. And come back over to 297, and he forces himself to eat for Henrietta, not for himself, but because she wants it. And he has a mouthful of each, and he sighs out with half groan, half wail, and she holds his fingers in hers, caressing him. He could feel the skin of her fingers, slippery smooth, warm against his own. Putua. That was the word that Tagaran had taught him. Putua. And he'd written the meaning in his book, to warm one's hand by the fire, and then to squeeze gently the fingers of another person. And I've just written Putua, that symbol of unity of mankind, compassion and care for one another rather than selfishness, which is what Henrietta is doing on maybe Rook's deathbed, and it's what Tagaran taught him all those years ago. And he thinks about Tagaran and wonders if she was alive, she would be grown, she'd have children, maybe even grandchildren, and she would probably tell them about the little child she'd been when she had Daniel Rook as a friend, and she would remember him. She would tell her children about him, and he remembers his notebooks, and he thinks of them, and these books had travelled with him, and he kept those books, but he'd never got them out, never read them, but it was enough for them to know that they were there. When he and Tagaran were both dead, these notebooks would tell the story of a friendship no other. And don't forget that the novel itself was written based on the conversations recorded in the notebooks of William Dawes. And the author, Kate Grenville, speaks about the fact that she included word for word the conversations, and she created this magical story to kind of explain what might have actually generated these conversations. And he always had hoped to go back to New South Wales. He'd, especially here on the islands of Antigua with black faces all around, he seemed closer to Tagaran. He felt himself travelling towards her. Only a slip of land and an ocean between him and New South Wales. But he knows now that he would never go back. New South Wales was unreachable. And he didn't have to look at the notebooks to remember every detail, how it looked, and the water. And he remembered, if he were to go back to that night on the sand of Botany Bay, would he make the same choice again, knowing that this was where it would lead him, to the raucous birds in the guava tree outside, to this moment? And he doesn't answer this question. This is like the end of the narrative at this point. He doesn't answer the question, but I think the implication is that we can all agree as readers is that, yes, he would make this same choice again. He doesn't feel regret. He knows he's done the right thing. I guess he might feel regret possibly at the fact he doesn't get to go back and see Tagaran, but still he knows he's done the right thing, and we can infer that as readers. And then here we go back into a flashback, and it ends with a flashback. Now, don't forget, the literary term for a flashback is analepsis. Okay. So that's just the meta language. And this is the last day last time he sees Tagaran. So this is the last morning in New South Wales. He woke up early, and the ship, the Gorgon, was going to take him back to England, and they'd waited a long time for these ships to come, and they came very quickly after this meeting with the governor. And you don't have the power. I don't have the power to convene a court-martial, but I will send you back at the earliest opportunity to face a court-martial. And he had hoped to spend the rest of his life in New South Wales, but actually he ended up only being there another month. And so on this last day, he goes up, he looks at the stars, Betelgeuse and Rigel, and he thinks about the stars and how when the speck of matter called Daniel Rook, millions of years, thousands of years in the future, when he was no longer even a name on a forgotten gravestone, when the gravestone itself had worn away, even then, Rigel and Betelgeuse would still be travelling together across the sky. The stars are unchanging. There are some things that are permanent. And he lit a fire, he made some sweet tea. Warabura, remember that symbol of the depth of emotion that he feels, the belonging he feels to New South Wales. And he breathes and again sees those birds. So then, as the ship left, he stood at the back of the ship at the stern and looked up towards this point. And as he looks up, he can just make out the figure of Tagaran. And she, that morning, had arrived, not leaping down the rocks as she usually did. They barely spoke. And she crouched over his little fire, helped her hands out to it, so close she might have burned her palms. And as she'd done on that one other occasion, she took his hands between hers. He felt her pressing and smoothing, transferring their heat to his. He closed his eyes. His skin had taken on the warmth of hers, so he no longer knew which was hers and which was his. The putua. When the men came for his chest, Rook and Tagaran just looked at each other and looked away. And he followed the men. And at the end, he didn't turn. He just kept his hand close tight around itself, around the warmth that she had put there, like he was trying to hold on metaphorically to her, and just kept going. And now he's on the ship looking, and he could see her, and she's standing on the rock, and he smiles, and she's actually stood as close to that ship as she could get while remaining on land. Like she also has this depth of affection for him that's unspoken. And between them, across the water, a long thread stretched out, spinning longer and longer as their figures grew. And soon Tagaran became indistinguishable from the rocks around her, the rocks indistinguishable from the headland nothing more than the distant part of the landscape. Tagaran was invisible now, but she was part of everything he could see, like the faintest, most distant star, sending its steady light out towards him across space. And the note that I wrote here was that link back to page 14, where he talks about like the cosmic breathe and that idea of how the interconnectedness of humanity and the constants of truth and the fact that I guess life is about so much more than just one individual, and that echoing that at the end here, the fact that it ends with that beautiful image of Putua, ends with the importance of connection and the importance of humanity. And I think that is probably what Kate Grenville is really trying to get at, the beautiful relationship between these two unlikely friends that through shared values and appreciation of language and learning and their unlikely friendship, Rook is able to, I guess, become more than he ever was or he ever thought he could be. And There's a celebration of that relationship. There's a celebration of uniqueness. There's a celebration of friendship and of being true to oneself, being true to one's conscience, and doing the right thing, even at great personal cost. And so that is the end of Lieutenant. Thank you for joining me. All the best with your essays, and we'll catch you next book.